Hi, everyone. Welcome to my session. My name is David Ebo. I'm a software architect on the ASP.NET team. And obviously, this is the last session slot of the conference, so not too many people here as expected, and a bunch of you have already gone home. Hopefully, a bunch more will be watching online, millions, perhaps billions. So in any case, I'll try to make it interesting for those of you who've stayed till the end of the conference. So what am I going to talk about today? Mostly, this talk is about web forms. So first, I want to get a quick thing out of the way, which is the whole web form versus MVC thing. Obviously, if you've gone through the conference, you've seen a lot of talks relating to ASP.NET MVC, which we just released. People ask, web form versus MVC, which one should I use? In fact, there was an entire session devoted to that. And really, the answer is that it caters to slightly different audiences, and there is room for both. But this particular talk is specifically about the web form side of things. So in a quick show of hand, how many of you are web forms developers? OK, looks like pretty much all of you. And how many of you have tried playing around with the new MVC stuff? OK, that's great. So more specifically, this talk is about the data aspect of ASP.NET. And one of the big new things I'm going to talk about is a new data source we're introducing that we're calling the domain data source. And then I will also look how it ties in with dynamic data, which is a feature that we first released with 3.5 SP1. How many of you have played with dynamic data? A few of you. OK. And finally, I'll take a look at how we can take both dynamic data and this domain data source into an Azure cloud environment and do some pretty interesting things with that. So I guess this was the slide where I was supposed to tell MVC versus, but in any case, I'll start with a quick history of data sources in ASP.NET. So going back to 1.0, we simply did not have the concept of a data source control. Everything was very much manual. In 2.0, there was a major architectural change, and we introduced this concept of data sources. And we had a bunch of them. There was SQL data source and a few others. But more interesting to this discussion is object data source, which let you write a class that had essentially CRUD method that you could go against. Now, 3.5 was the big introduction of LINQ, language integrated queries. And along with that, we came up with LINQ data source, which knew how to talk to not really LINQ in general, but more specifically a LINQ to SQL data context. And then 3.5 SP1 was the entry of entity framework. And we wrote another data source, entity data source, which basically plays the same part that LINQ data source plays, but for EF instead of LINQ to SQL. So now we have this new domain data source. And it's just slightly different. In a sense, it's kind of a mix between object data source and the other two. It's a data source that knows how to deal with LINQ, but also lets you write your own CRUD method and does not sit directly on top of a LINQ, on top of a DAL, basically. And to show a very simplified architecture of how things work with when you use LINQ data source or entity data source, you basically have your ASP.NET page. And in there, you have a LINQ data source control, and it talks directly to LINQ to SQL. And the drawback of that is that it's not that easy to get in between. If you want to change how things are done, you pretty much have to hook into events in the data source, and you end up having to write code in the page, whereas that's probably not the best place for it. So now moving to this domain data source, the architecture changes a bit in the sense that we now have this new domain service that sits in the middle between your ASP.NET page and either LINQ to SQL or entity framework, or for that matter, any other technology could be used under the cover to implement your domain service. So interestingly, how many of you may have gone to Nikhil Kotari's talk on Alexandria and how he's doing writing Silverlight applications? Only 2 or 3. So in that talk, he introduced the domain service. This is the exact same beast he was talking about. It's just that in his case, he was using it to target Silverlight client. In this case, we're using it for ASP.NET. So I'll just move to the first demo, which is not msn.com. So what we have here, we don't yet have official project templates for this domain data source. So this is what doing new project would look like. There's a bunch of files there. A number of them relate to dynamic data. But initially, to keep things very clear, I will do a demo that does not involve dynamic data. It is pure, straight web form going against this data source. So I'll start with some fairly mundane tasks of adding database to the project. And this is when my hard drive falls asleep. It's happened before. It takes 5 seconds. It will come back. OK. So I'm using Northwind. I know, kind of lame. And now the next step is we need to create a model. And we could use Link to SQL or Entity Framework. I'm going to use Entity Framework. So I'll pick ADO.NET Entity Data Model. I'll call it and I'll have it generate a model based on Northwind. Okay, and it's going to ask me to pick which tables I want to include. And I'll pick a small subset, product, where is product, category, and suppliers. And I'll just say finish. And it's going to create that little model view where I'll show the relationship between those tables. And here I'm going to keep everything default. And this is the basic diagram showing relationship between product, category, suppliers. I'll just leave it alone. And now, so this is where, so far, everything I've shown so far, there is really nothing new. I just created an EF model. Now, if you were using link data source, you would directly go and author your page and put a link data source in there. Instead, I will be creating this new thing we're calling a domain service. So add new item now gives me this domain service class, which I'll just call catalog. And that's basically going to be a repository for the particular entities we care about. And here it finds that we have an EF model in there. And I'll tell it to generate CRUD methods for those classes. And for products, I'll also have it generate not only read-only, but the full CRUD method. Couple more things. I'll disable this. That's for the Silverlight scenario. We don't care. And I'll also check this one to generate another file, which we'll look into later. So now that I did this, it generated the most important file is this catalog.cs, which is a domain service. Let me maximize things a little bit. I just found this great key combination. Alt-Shift-Enter gives more space. So what we have here is a class which extends domain service, although in this case it extends it indirectly via this derived link to entities domain service, which is parameterized by my entity framework model. So if I go to definition of this, this is my standard entity framework object context. Now, what do we have in this domain service class? We very simply have CRUD methods. So for categories, we have get categories. For products, we have not only get products, but also insert, update, delete, simply because that's what we asked for when we created it. And finally, we have get suppliers. OK? So now, I'll go and generate completely from scratch a simple ASP.NET file that uses this. Just keep the default name. So later on, I'll show how to use dynamic data against this, but I really want to make a point that this new domain data source is not at all tied to dynamic data. It works with dynamic data, but it works also very well by itself. So if some of you, are interested in data source controls, but not so much in the dynamic data aspect, this very much applies. So let's go and create a simple page. I'll just start with the grid view. And let's add this new data source, domain data source. Okay, so I need to do a few more things, obviously. I need to tie them together. I do this by saying data source ID equal domain DS. How many of you have done a similar thing with data sources before, hooking up a data control and a data source? Very, very basic stuff. And I'll also say again? Oh, yes, thank you. Is that why it's underlined and green? So I'll tell it to auto-generate columns. And now let's see what we need to do. So we have this domain data source. We haven't told it what to work with. Right now, it has no idea. So there's two key pieces of information that I need to tell it. The first one is the domain service type name, simply telling it, yeah, this is the class that we're going to use. So we have this catalog, which is in this namespace. Ignore the fact that it's called dynamic data project. This is an artifact of the fact that this was not a real project template. So catalog. And the second piece of information is to tell it what kind of entities it's going to work with, and more specifically, what select method is going to use. So I'll tell it select method equal get products. And one key point is that if you're wondering why can't I just tell it it's products, and why do you have to tell it the method, the answer is simply that you could have multiple methods to get products sorted by this, and so on. So let's try to go ahead and run this. Okay, and we get your basic standard view. So far, everything looks the same as it would if you were to use linked data source directly. And actually, one more thing I'll do is I'll enable editing on the grid view. Auto-generate edit button equal true. And I'll just perform a simple edit just to show that. So a few questions you may have here is, I told it what select method to use. I did not tell it what update method to use. How did it know which one? And that's simply signature-based. Whereas you can have multiple select methods for the other three, the CUD method, create, update, delete, you can only have one. And by telling it the select method, it basically knew that I'm dealing with a product, and therefore that this was the method to use. So now let's start looking at what are the benefits of using this approach versus going straight to link to SQL via a link to SQL data source or entity framework. I'm referring to one versus the other. The model is essentially equivalent. And really, the answer comes down to how much control you have over your data. Here, really, the most important point about this class is that any data access that's going to happen is going to go through your method. The data source itself has no ability to get or set data of any form without you telling it to do it. So a quick way to demonstrate this is here, let's tell it to further filter the products list. For instance, here we have this reorder level, which sometimes is 0. Let's eliminate those. I can just say dot where product reorder level greater than 0. And I'll refresh, and looking at this column here, all the zeros are gone. So I'm certainly not saying that you could not do that with linked data source, but in order to do it, you would have had to write code which in a place where you would ideally not want to, which is the page itself. Here we're keeping that logic entirely out of the page. So I'll go and remove this logic here. And Now let's look at what can we do with update method. Well, we can do pretty much anything we want. Let's say we want to add something to the product name as it's being edited. I can say product name plus equal, let's just put an exclamation mark to demonstrate this. And as I edit this item again, update, and you get this. So nothing spectacular, but again, much easier to do and much cleaner than it would otherwise be. What else can we do? Let's say, in addition to wanting to modify the data, you may want to complain that something is wrong with the update. So I can do this. Let's remove this line. And so really, the key things to look at is that even though the pattern of having this CRUD method is standard to the domain service, you will always use those when you have a domain service, what you write inside of your method is completely agnostic. It's based on what specific technology you're using. In this case, we're using entity framework. Therefore, context, this is our link to SQL context. I'm sorry, our entity framework context. And everything you write in there is specific to that. If we're using link to SQL, this would look different. It wouldn't be attached as modified. It'd be, I forget what it's called. And if you use a yet completely different, even non-Microsoft DAL, you would just write whatever is the right line of code that will perform this update. So now let's see how we can deal with a situation where the product has some fields that we don't like. Let's just say if reorder level equal, say, 17, we'll throw a validation exception. And let's say bad reorder, whatever. OK. And now, as I try to perform an edit and set reorder level to 17, it's going to blow up. So initially, it doesn't look pretty because there's nothing to handle that exception. But going back to the page, we have this new type of validator. I assume most of you are familiar with ASP.NET validators. We have this new validator that we call a domain validator. And I tell it to validate, control to validate equal the grid view. And by doing this, another very small thing I need to do, which is actually something that will go away. Enable. Never remember the name of that property. Yes, enable model validation equal true. This will not be needed by the time we ship. OK, so let's try to do the same thing. And again, setting reorder level to 17. And now we have this validator firing up. So of course, right now it doesn't look super pretty, but it's using standard ASP.NET validator architecture, which means you could put a validation summary control in there. It would show in that area. It would show along with potentially other validation errors. I mean, it fits in the standard ASP.NET validation architecture. Now, going back to the page, so early on, we had changed the getProduct method to filter the product some more. But what if you don't want to do the filtering from the inside, but you want to pass in a parameter? So we were filtering by reorder level. Now let's see what it would be like to write a second getProduct method, which we'll call getProducts filtered. And here we'll pass, let's just call it main, which is the minimum reorder level that we want to allow. So now in order to write this, we would the best way to do it is to actually use the one that returns everything and to say return getProducts.where. And we just tell it to only show things where the reorder level is greater than min. And actually, to make it slightly better, instead of just making it an integer, we'll make it an optional integer to allow for the null case where we don't want this filtering to happen. And we'll add a little check that says if min is null, then we'll just return all of them. Okay? So now that we have that, of course, this method that takes a parameter is not going to magically get called. You have to have UI that can get this parameter and connect the whole thing together. So let's take a look at how this is done. And it's all using pretty standard ASP.NET technique, web forms technique, where let's first put together some simple UI. Yeah, just a text box. ID. Let's call it filter. And let's also add a button so we can submit. Okay, so that's just the UI. It's not hooked up. But after we do let's first change the name of the method, of course. We want to call this getProductsFiltered. And in here, we have this concept of select parameters. And now we use a very standard control parameter, telling it to get its value from the filter text box, which we just called filter. Okay. Oops. Refresh behavior, yes. Oh, yes, small thing I forgot. I need to tell it the name of the parameter, which was min. This refers to the name of the parameter in the method we created. So initially, reorder level is non-filtered, and if I enter a number, like 10, I look at this reorder column, and we get this. So again, this is a case where the behavior is very much driven by your domain service. You're keeping all your logic in there, and the page is just referring to that without having to hard-code any logic you wouldn't want to have in the page. So another very interesting concept we're introducing with this data source, and which actually will be available for other data sources as well, is something we call the query extender. So the query extender, he's doing better than me. Thank you. So this query extender, I guess I was fishing for that. This is a control that lives alongside the data source and that applies additional filtering to it. So we just give it target control ID means, yeah, this is the data source you're going to work with, domain DS. And in here, we can have one or more filters. So what are filters? They can be essentially things that produce arbitrary link expression that get composed with whatever the domain service returns. So one of the things that we support is search expression. And a search expression, first we need to tell it what kind of search we want to do, meaning contains, ends, or start with. Let's do a contain. And we'll tell it that it should work on the product name column. And now let's add some UI for that. And let's not get fancy. We'll just put another text box to get the search value. And in here, I can just do, again, very standard stuff, control parameter, control ID equals search. So now, yeah, sorry for the bad UI. The second text box is the one we just added for search. So let's do some random search string, and here we are. So to talk a little bit about exactly what happened there. Oh. It's too much, isn't it? So really what's very, very interesting here is that we have a method which returns an equable of product. And in this method, it can use ling to do some arbitrary filtering, potentially based on the parameter that's passed in. And then it returns that to the domain data source. But in there, the power of link lets us apply additional composition to the link query. And in this case, it's applying something that's going to look like and where the product name includes whatever that string was. And the whole thing ends up being built into a single link query. So it's not like we're doing any kind of client-side filtering here. It's both the filtering that we do inside the domain service and on the outside ends up as a single optimized link query, which basically ends up as a SQL query. So that concludes the first demo, where I specifically stayed away from showing anything related to dynamic data to really make the point that this domain data source is not a dynamic data thing. Now, let's talk about dynamic data. So since a number of you have not seen it, I'll give sort of a quick introduction about what it is. And it's basically a way to get you started with data-driven web application very quickly. And it supports a form of scaffolding. But that word is a little bit dangerous because sometimes it feels like, oh, it's only doing scaffolding and it doesn't let you do like more custom thing. But that's really not the case. It really produces things that are very customizable in many ways. And what it's really good at is doing validation on your model, like setting rules for certain fields and having some UI automatically available and generated to enforce those rules. And it also supports powerful filtering that go a little bit beyond what I showed you with the query block that had the search. And another nice thing that it provides is the same kind of routing features that you have in MVC. They really share the same engine. Like most people think that the routing engine is part of ASP.NET MVC. The reality is that it is not. It was shipped in 3.5 SP1. MVC uses the exact same, and dynamic data uses it as well. So now how does dynamic data relate to this new domain data source? And the answer is that they basically work together, just like dynamic data is able to work over a link to SQL data source, link data source, or entity data source. It can work with the domain data source. And what's nice is that in a sense you get the best of both worlds. You get sort of the power and magic of dynamic data that does a lot of things automatically, yet you still have full control over your domain service where you 100% own your CRUD methods and no data operation will happen outside of that. So again, very briefly, this is nearly identical to what I showed you earlier, except earlier I had the top box being ASP.NET. Now I'm saying it's dynamic data, but it really doesn't make much difference. In the old, if you go straight with link to SQL or entity framework data source, it talks directly to it, while with the new model, we have this box in between, which is the domain service. Dynamic data only talks to that, and then your code in the domain service talks to whatever your data layer is. So let's continue this same application that we had started, and we're not going to be using this webform.aspx anymore. And instead, we're going to tell this site to use dynamic data. So it already contains all the basic files of dynamic data because that's the project template would have contained all of that. The really only thing I need to do is go to my global.asax and register my domain service with dynamic data. And my domain service is named catalog. And that's really the only thing I need to do. Oops, sorry about that. Going back to the browser, if I go to the root of the site, it's going to show me in a dynamic data way all the tables that it sees as being available from this domain service. So let's click on products and see what happens. Here, what we have is a view is pretty similar to what we had with the grid view, but it's also a little bit smarter in many ways. Like it automatically produces filters for foreign keys, as well as Boolean fields, like discontinued. And one key thing I'd like you to notice is on every row, I'm able to do an edit, a delete, and I can also add items. While if I go to categories, I can view the details of a category, but I can't do an edit, a delete, or an insert. Can you guys tell me why that's the case? Right. The answer is that when we created our domain service, we asked it basically to generate all the CRUD methods for product, but for categories, all we have is get categories. And dynamic data recognizes that fact and only lets you do what you're allowed to do. This actually goes a little bit farther than that. So here we have update product method. So first I'll show you, suppose the update product method was to just disappear. So here we're able to click edit. Now I'll just remove this method temporarily and refresh the page, and edit is gone. Okay? Now I'll bring it back, but now we'll do something slightly different. There are cases where you do want the operation to be available, but not to everyone, only to some users. Let's say deleting a product is an operation that only some users should be able to do. What you do in here is you put a requires authentication or requires roles attribute. Requires authentication basically means anybody who is authenticated can do it. Require roles is more specific, says you not only have to be authenticated, but you have to be in certain roles. Let's stick to the simple one for now. Both of them are based on standard ASP.NET role management, so this all using existing techniques. Did I rebuild? If I refresh, we'll see that okay, edit is back because I uncommented the method, but delete is gone. Now, let's try to see what happens if I am authenticated. I have some really basic UI that I added just to be able to authenticate myself. So I'll register a little test account. And this is totally standard ASP.NET support that's built in to really easily create a basic user database. Takes a few seconds the first time because it actually has to create the ASP.NET MDF, which contains the role. So now it's done. And it says, okay, welcome, David. I'm authenticated. I go to products. I can now delete. Just to show it to you again, I can log out, and I no longer can. So obviously here I'm only showing you the require authentication. You could do arbitrary roles and fairly complex stuff in there. So let's look at this page again. And here, if you look at categories and suppliers, you see the ID of the category. It is clickable, which is nice. But what would be even nicer would be to see the name of the category and the supplier in this column. And normally, dynamic data does that by default. The problem is, if we look at our domain service, the way we're getting products, this is using Entity Framework, and we have not told it to do a joint and include the category and the supplier. And if it was linked to SQL, it would actually do it on demand. Entity Framework doesn't do it, so we need to be explicit. And the way it's done in Entity Framework is by adding an include, and I'll say include categories. Now if I refresh, we see that category is actually showing me the category name, while suppliers is not. You're probably wondering, like, how does it pick which field to give you? Because there could be a number of them that could be interesting. And it's just a default heuristic, which is very easily overridable, and you could pick any field that you want, or a combination of fields. Let's see. Yes, let's talk a little bit about routing. Check the clock. Yes. So routing is something that is defined in global.asax. And if you look at our URLs here, the URL looks like product, which is the table name, and list.aspx. The reason it looks like that is because the route tells it to. Now, suppose you wanted it to look different, like you may not want the extension to make it look cleaner, and for whatever reason, let's decide to switch the action and the table name in the URL. I rebuild, go back to the start page, and automatically you see that now the URL is list/product, and this applies throughout the site. I could say if I click detail, the same thing happens. Here, the product ID is still being passed on the query string. Again, you could very easily, by writing slightly fancier routes, make that be part of the URL itself and not the query string. And I'm not going to go super fancy into routes because it's a big topic in itself, and you can do very fancy things. In this case, I only have one route. You could have specific routes for only for product edit. You want the URL to look like that and such. But really, the key point is that whereas in standard web forms, you typically have a URL which points directly to where the physical file is. When you use routing, it's not the case. You have a URL that has a certain shape, which gets parsed out by the routing engine and then gets mapped to the proper handler. So it's quite a little bit of a mind shift when you're really used to seeing URLs that point straight to an ASPX file. So what else can we do about dynamic data? One of the things that it's really good at is validation. And we'll go earlier on, I showed you that when I created my domain service, it created two files. Catalog.cs is the one we've been spending most of the time on. We also have this metadata file. And what this is basically something to get you quickly started. It has those metadata classes which are associated with each entity type. And in each class, for instance, products, it has a list of all the properties, so they are readily available to add metadata to it. And let's just show a standard dynamic data style thing, which is to take, say, units in stock and ask that the range of this should be only between 0 and 200, and we can specify a message optionally. Oops, bad range, whatever. So I'll do this. And now, going back to the list of product and trying to perform an edit, I'll try to change units on order to a big number. And as I just try to tab out, oops, wrong one. Didn't work. Oh, yeah, thank you. Applauding you now. Okay, this is bad range. If I update, thank you. So, and another thing I didn't show you is something like product name. If I try to remove it altogether, it automatically tells me I can't do that, even though I didn't specifically tell it to. The reason it knows is that it derived this information essentially from the schema, which it gets indirectly from the domain service. So it tries to flow as much information as possible from initially the SQL store to the domain service to the UI. And in this case, this is really client-side JavaScript UI that's happening. So it's like as close to the user as possible, which means you don't even have to submit to get that information. So another cool thing you can do with dynamic data is that the rendering is very flexible. Right now, I really haven't shown you how dynamic data works, what are the files that make it work. But let's just focus on the UI for getting these units in stock. And right now, it's just a text box. Let's say instead we wanted it to be more of a slider control. Since we have a range for it, a slider is very appropriate. And out of the box, you can do that. But there is a very pluggable model where we have something called field templates, where a field template is a small user control that does the rendering for one cell. And here, I'll just go and add an existing control that I've created ahead of time, which is on the field templates. And again, the hard drive falling asleep. There we go. And it's called integer slider. And what I need to tell it to do here, oops, I'll give it what we call a UI hint. And now if I refresh, if all goes well, I now have this range picker. And the really nice thing is, I'll take one. Yeah. The way this is written, if I go in integer slider, in this particular case, it's using the Ajax toolkit, but you're absolutely not limited to that. You could use Telerik control or any third-party control. It's very pluggable. Everything you do is very explicit in there. I just happen to have an Ajax toolkit slider extender in there. And some of the other things that we can do is fancier filtering. So if we look at this drop down here, we are picking one supplier. What if you wanted to do filtering and pick an arbitrary set of suppliers or of categories? The way we could do this is, again, on the dynamic data, I have field templates. I also have a concept of filter templates. By default, I only have a few, but I can import some fancier ones. And this time I have them under. That could get annoying. I have this multi-foreign key template. I'll just import that. And under categories, I'll tell it to use, now instead of a UI hint, it's a filter UI hint. And we're just going to use the one we imported called multi-foreign key. Yeah. All right. And now we see that where we used to have a drop-down which only let us pick one, we have now a collection of checkbox. So say I want to get rid of produce and meat, I would just unclick them. And this happens automatically. So the idea is that this is just a custom filter that we wrote. You can write arbitrary filter. The way a filter is written is essentially you get an iQueryable in, and you get to do arbitrary filtering on it. You return a new iQueryable. That's the query that's going to happen. And the nice thing is, because, again, this is using link composition, this turns into a single optimized SQL query in the end. This is not client filtering happening here. OK. So how are we doing on time? Yes. Let's get back to our slide. And I want to also very quickly show you another demo to show that dynamic data is usable in scenarios other than those big scaffolding. So this little site here is a site that was written, is a simple page that was written identically using dynamic data and without dynamic data. And I just want to show you like the benefit that that has. And here, if I click the 2.0 style, we get this site where I can select something and I can edit it here. And if I go back to this one, it looks basically identical. Now what I want to show you is how differently they are written. And they also have all kind of validation going on, things like that. And just a small note, like if I look at things that are URL, they're clickable, email addresses go to a mail to URL. So there's all kind of logic that's in there. Now, if we look at the old page, let's maximize the space again. What we have here, I'm going to go fairly quickly in there, but basically it's a details view that has a bunch of template fields. And for each template field, you need to do a whole lot of work. For things like when you want to pick, let's go to edit again, and here I have a drop-down for category. You need to do those things very, very manually, where you have your drop-down list and another data source in there. And for validation, you need to explicitly have all of your validators and so on. And it just goes on and on and on. And to do this fairly simple page, you end up having 200 and so lines. Now, looking at the same file or the same basic page but written the dynamic data way, going down, we have, this is what our details view looks like. It just has one dynamic field per field that you want to show. And the behavior of those fields is driven via the data model instead of being done explicitly. You don't have to put a required field validator because it knows from the model that this applies. And we end up with something that's only, 85 lines. So we went down from 210 to 85. And this is really a case, there is no scaffolding per se, there is no routing. This is something you can use without having to go all the way into dynamic data. You can take existing pages and make them quite a bit simpler using this technology. So I don't want to spend much more time on that, but let's, I'm sorry, this was the demo, sorry, out of sync with the slides. So now I want to show you some very, very cool things relating to using this technology in the cloud. So the idea is we just want to be able to write simple entity classes instead of having to deal with real databases and link to SQL or entity framework. We just want to write classes and have them somehow turn into things that are stored in the cloud. And using the domain service, we can have a very nice model that's both simple and powerful to do this. Under the cover, this is relying on Azure table storage, which are their concept of tables, but they are quite different from what you usually think of as table in the database world, because a table in Azure is simply defined by saying, yes, I want to create a table named foo. You never tell it any kind of schema. They use what we call flexible entities, where any row in the table is an arbitrary bag of name-value pairs. And this is what makes the model so simple. And a point here is I'm going to show you a demo that uses dynamic data over that, but I could just as easily write simple ASP.NET pages like I did early on that would also use that. So the model now this is again pretty much the same diagram I've showed you, except now the bottom box, instead of being entity framework or link to SQL, is the Azure cloud. How are we doing on time? 26 minutes. So this is the last project. Yes. So this is an app, again, what could be an empty project template to work with the cloud. Actually, it's not completely empty. There's one thing I'll show you first, that in web.config, I do have some configuration that tells it to use my storage account. So this is my real cloud storage account. In fact, this is like the secret value, which you can only see the first half by design. So what are we going to do here? So earlier on, the first step was to import a database, and then we would create an entity framework model over it. Now, we'll directly go and create a model. And let's add a new class. And let's call it MIX09. Trying to make it live and interesting. So initially, it's just a completely simple class. And what I'll do here is I'll extend something that may look slightly funky at first, because it looks like there's some bizarre recursion going on, but bear with me on that. So this is a slightly strange declaration that allows everything to work later. So what I have here is that class in which I can just write properties. That's the way you should look at it. And I'm just going to add a property. For instance, let's go with the name. Let's add some Boolean. Say, having fun. And let's do another one. Date, time, date, leaving. So this is basically the closest thing I'm doing to creating a database. I'm just writing a class. So now that we have that, we're moving on to creating a domain service over that. And in this case, I'll just do it completely from scratch. Let's call it, again, catalog. Seems to be the common name for those things. And what's interesting is that now, since we're in a very simple world, I don't need the support of a fancy base class like we had with Entity Framework. I'm directly going to extend domain service. In here, all I need to do is write my CRUD method. So I'll start with the select method, which I want to return an iCrobal of MIX10D. And we'll call it the obvious. So where it gets really nice is how I implement this method. All I need to do is say return MIX09.query. And that's sort of what we got by using this slightly funky base type declaration, is that we have those static things on it that make certain operations very easy. And likewise, I'm going to write a select method. An update method. Update, oops, why do we class? I'll take in, what am I doing wrong here? I'm not inside, oh, thank you. Yes. Okay, and the way I implement this, again, is completely trivial. I'm being passed this attendee object, and I want to save it to the store. The way I do it is as simple as calling attendee.save. And along the same line, I'm going to write a method to insert new attendees, and the implementation is the same. This also says this save method works both with a new entity or an existing entity you're updating. It's really taking the data API to the simplest possible level. And once I have that, since I'm going to be using dynamic data, I do need to do the little one-liner in here that registers my domain service. Let me maximize this again. And we'll do our catalog thing. And let's run it and see what happens. So obviously, this demo requires a live connection to the Azure store, and hopefully I do have a connection that I can rely on. So the first part, it found that there was only this one table exposed. There are no entries at first, but it does give me the ability to add one. And I can say, OK, Joe, having fun, leaving, not for a while, insert. And boom, we have this entry here. Now, let's add another one. Bill, not having fun, already gone. Let's just add 3 just to make it more interesting. Automatically, I get this filtering like we had seen earlier in the dynamic data demo. So you're probably wondering, like, where is that data? And as I told you earlier, this is in the Azure table store, and I have a tool which can show that. Where is that tool? This guy here. And this is my store, and it shows me the list of tables that I have. All of those things are just random test tables. And there's a new one that just appeared called MIX09, and then it doesn't respond. I may have to kill it and try again, but well, in any event, you see the data on the screen, what came up. Oh, is it happy again? Yes, okay, this is the data that we just entered. Now let's see what happens if I want to add another field to my entity. So we have this, MIX09. Let's say now we also want to deal with the concept of age. And that's really all I need to do. Now if I go back in here and refresh, of course everyone is really young, but I can go and change that. And so on. As expected, once I go in here, now you have this new thing that automatically came up. I mean, contrast that with what you would have to do in a much more schematized SQL world, where you would have to go and deal with changing table and doing things like that. Here, you literally have your entity, and it gets automatically mapped to what looks like a table. Of course, the reality is, because it's a very unschematized world, each of those entities here you can look at as being a dictionary, collection of name-value pairs. And because this is dynamic data, I can do all the fun stuff that we showed before. I mean, I could do a range to import a namespace. Let's do again. Okay, you clearly have to be 18 to be here. And now if I try to get out of that range, I get this validation. So really, all the goodies that we've seen with both dynamic data and domain service apply here. Or to show more stuff in domain service, even though our implementation here is dead simple, you're absolutely not limited to that, of course, because you get this attendee here. You could totally say attendee.name equal attendee.name.toUpper. And this is the update method. Now, if I perform, let's refresh here, and if I change, let's just put bill2 here, and sure enough, now we have capitalized thing. So let me see how much time I have, 16 minutes. So yes, since we have a few minutes, I'll actually go back to the previous demo that was more showing dynamic data and show a little bit more of what makes it work, because I left a lot of things kind of mysterious without going into detail. And what we have here, let's just take a closer look at the various things that we have under this dynamic data folder. We've looked at field templates and filters. So field templates is the thing that renders one cell inside one value, basically. Filters template is what allowed us to have this fancy filter that had all the checkboxes and things. There are other things we haven't looked at, and the important one are page templates and entity templates. So let's take a quick look. What is a page template? We have one for each kind of view that we have. So like list is the view that, let's go back and run it again. I apologize for switching back and forth between demos, but I was worried I was a little short on time. But since we have a few minutes, let's close this. Yes. So I go to products, and here I'm seeing this view. What is making this thing happen is the fact that I have this list.aspx, which contains fairly standard ASP.NET things. It has a grid view, and it has a domain data source, like the demo I showed you earlier. But the major distinction is that it has no table-specific information, because the same page is supposed to work for all the tables. Just to show you that very quickly, if I add like exclamation mark, why is it read-only? Here, and refresh, we get exclamation mark here. If I then go to categories, it happens as well, because this is a template that is used for all the tables. Now, instead, if I wanted to specifically for the product table have something different, what I would do is take this list.aspx, copy it under custom pages/products, and I would have a copy there which would override the default behavior. And you can do it for list, insert, edit, details, and so on. So I'm not going to go into details of that. You get the general idea for those page templates. Now, entity templates is actually a new concept which did not exist in SP1. And the idea here is if I go to the details view of something, the entity template is what renders just one entity. And the best way to demonstrate this, or let's go to the edit mode. If I go to entity templates here and I look at the edit entity template, this is something that repeats over the values, basically. So every row that you see here is one iteration, if you may, of this template. Again, the best way to say that is to put some little text here. And if I refresh, now every row has this. And again, right now this applies to all the entities. If I go to show the detail of one category and put in edit mode, I'll get this. maybe category is what I was looking at already, but I mean, you get the idea. It applies to all of them. I could make copies of this thing and make them specific to a particular entity. So you sort of get to first customize at a global level if you can do it in a way that is agnostic to any entity, or if you get to the level of customization that does not allow you to do that, you can go and have your private entity-specific thing, both for page templates and entity templates. So this pretty much concludes our talk, and I'll go again through the key takeaway, the things we've talked about. So first of all, MVC versus web form, well, it's a matter of choice. They're both still perfectly good. Web form is really not going away. As you can see, we're doing active development on that, even though MVC is getting the buzz more because it's new. And it is exciting, There is still a lot of new things happening in web forms. So what else did we look at today? Really, the big one is the domain data source, which we apply to all the various scenarios that we looked at. There was always that piece in the middle, which lets you essentially have more control over your data. Like, remove the magic of having ASP.NET pages stuck straight to the data access layer. Have your code in between. And we show how it applied to dynamic data. And finally, we showed some, I think, very cool way to apply that to the cloud. We have some bits that are available on CodePlex. If you go to asp.net/dynamic data, it will take you there. Not everything I showed today is there, but the domain data source is. I think the only part that isn't there today is the cloud stuff, and we will try to get it on there at some point if there is interest. We also have a forum on asp.net dynamic data. If you have any question about this technology or comments, it's a good place to post. And you can also email me directly, david.abo@microsoft.com. And please complete the evaluation form on the way out. They told us to make a strong case about that. And that's it. So thank you. So now I'll take any questions that you guys have. Yep.
So that domain data source is
yep.
part of the dynamic entity download? Dynamic data download?
Yes. The domain data source is part of that download. Yeah, it's just slightly confusing because the download is sort of named dynamic data, but the domain data source part is not tied to it in any way. Oh, no. Service Pack 1 did not have any domain data source. The Service Pack 1 is what we shipped last summer. Now I'm talking about much newer bits that we have only available on CodePlex. No, in the Azure table, can you have relationship between tables? And the answer is no. It really is a very different type of store that is meant to be highly scalable, and it is not a relational store. Of course, you can create pseudo relationship by having a column in one of them point to the primary key of another one, but it's not. You're not going to get referential constraint and stuff like that. Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I'm sure you're all ready to go home now.